Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. Today, we are joined by two best-selling authors, Philippe Sands and Hadley Freeman. Philippe is one of the UK's most prominent human rights barristers, a professor of law at UCL, and author of East, West Street and The Rat Line. Hadley is a journalist, a writer for The Guardian, and author of 4 books, including House of Glass. In today's live stream, Hadley and Philippe will discuss their books, both histories of World War II, the Holocaust, and its aftermath. The structure of tonight's event will be Hadley interviewing Philippe for about 20 minutes, followed by Philippe interviewing Hadley for about 20 minutes. Then there will be a Q&A session for both authors. You can submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, welcome Hadley and Philippe.
Thanks so much, Dana. So Philippe, I'll ask the obvious question first. I'm sure everyone watching read East, West Street, and that was a book that was born out of really your interest in your family. That's kind of what triggered it. And I wondered what it was like now working on The Rat Line, which is about someone else's family as opposed to your own.
I mean, there was straight away a family connection because Otto Wächter, who is one of the main characters of The Rat Line, of course, was the governor of Galicia in Lemberg, which is where my grandfather's family originated from, and hence he was directly responsible for the deaths of my grandfather's entire family, and probably also actually for a large part of your family that remained over there. There is that point of connection, which we'll come back to the various points of connection. So there was immediately a personal connection. The first time that I met the son, Horst, that was important for him. And he felt connected to me, not because he felt a sense of responsibility for what his father had done, but because he understood at a human level that I had a direct point of connection with him. In answer to your question, it went 2 ways. It was a liberation in one sense. I didn't have to worry about how I presented my own family, which of course is a constraint on how we write about people. On the other hand, it was a sadness. I sort of missed them. You write about people who are directly connected to you in a different way. But I think in this one, they were hovering on the horizon, just looking over my shoulder, because it is, in a sense, a very personal book.
But was it hard writing about Horst's family, knowing he's reading it? I mean, you have that responsibility. It's in some ways, it's almost, when you write about your own family, you're like, well, it's my family. I write about them how I want. Now you're writing someone else's family, and he's alive and very much with you through the process.
Well, I've got some practice. I mean, for those who followed this saga, I met Horst in 2011. I was introduced to him by the son of Hans Frank, Nicholas Frank, with whom I have a very close relationship. And that he was a fascinating character. I went to his castle in Austria. I was shown family documents, presents from Himmler, photo albums. And I had a conversation with an editor at the Financial Times, and she said, why don't you write a profile of him? So I did. That was the first step. I wrote it. He didn't like it at all. He actually took to writing comments on the FT's pages, complaining about the article, which I sort of loved. It was very endearing. But then after 6 weeks of irritation, he wanted more. And somehow we got to make a BBC Storyville film together, which is called My Nazi Legacy, What Our Fathers Did. His immediate reaction to that was also one of intense irritation. He said it had the wrong title. It should be called What Our Fathers Did and Didn't Do. So he does have a sense of humor. And he then downed tools for about 6 more weeks, and then he was back for more. Then we made a podcast together, which he didn't like at all, but he came back, and I'm waiting for the response to the book. So there's been a silence for 10 days, and something will emerge shortly. He may well be watching this.
Well, this is my next question. As a journalist, it amazes me how he keeps coming back to you. When I've done interviews with somebody and they haven't liked it, they've like raged about me on Twitter, and then I never hear from them again. They don't then come back and say, hey, you know what, let's make a movie together. What is this dynamic with the two of you?
I think it's a complicated relationship, but I think one of the things that's happened is we've been very honest with each other. I didn't come to it as a journalist. I came to it I didn't know I was writing a book. I didn't, when I first met him, it was purely a human interest. I was curious to meet the son of the man who was the governor and the deputy of Hans Frank. And one thing then led to another. So the initial relationship was not journalistic. And I was essentially trying to persuade him that his father was a mass murderer and a criminal. And he was trying to persuade me that his dad was actually a terrific bloke. And so we were in this waltz, this dance. And one of the things that's characterized that dance over 10 years is intense honesty. And we've been straight with each other at all times, which is why in the book, a couple of friends have complained, why do I give him so much space? And the answer to that is, that's the deal. I promised him I would let him make his arguments in the book and let the reader form their own view and would not give my reactions to his views. So I think it's been a very honest relationship. It's been a trusting relationship. We've played straight with each other all along. He's been very generous. If I ask for a document, he gives me a document. If there's a photograph I'm looking for, he gives me the photograph. If he doesn't like something I've done, he tells me, we talk about it. And it is, in a sense, a trusting but complex relationship.
Well, my next question is about your side of this relationship. What is it that's kept you with him through all this time? This has been a long process now. I mean, it seems like reading the book, listening to the podcast, watching the movie, there's this need in you to get him to see the truth. And is that what sort of binds you to him? Whereas, someone else might be like, this is, this deluded son of a Nazi, walk away, forget it. But there is something that seems to be driving you that needs him to see this.
I think the question is probably better put to my wife, who would, I'm sure, have her own answer. But you're absolutely right. I mean, in a sense, we are probably both slightly deluded. I mean, I did a first interview with him back in 2012, published a profile in 2013. Why didn't I let go then? And I've asked myself that question a lot. And I think the answer to that question is in a sense to do with the other part of my life, which is working as an academic, but also as a practicing lawyer before international courts and tribunals. In my world, we have a system of justice that is delivered through courts. If you're guilty, if you're charged with something, you have a trial. You are then convicted or not guilty. If you're not convicted, you're innocent. If you're convicted, you're guilty. And it leads to a sort of binary situation where someone either is or is not an international criminal. What happens in the case of Horst and with millions of others is that most people don't get charged. Most people either kill themselves or disappear, or in Otto's case, disappear and then dies in strange circumstances in the Vatican, which is what I was really interested in the second half of the 10 years that I've done this. But I was intensely bothered about the fact that Horst could look me in the eye and say, my father died an innocent man, which in my language as a lawyer is correct. I mean, it's not challengeable. He was never convicted. And I suppose it bothered me more and more that with Horst's insistence, I needed to go the extra mile. I needed to find the material. So when I first met him, he said, there's no indictment, there's no documents, there's no charges, there's nothing. It took me 3 years to find the actual indictment, which was lost in an obscure Warsaw archive. You know all about that exercise. And having found that, I thought that Horst would say, oh, okay, yeah, okay, now I accept it. But I showed it to him and he wiggled out of it. He said, this is a Soviet document. And so each time I got closer and closer, he would sort of infuriatingly find a way to wiggle around it. And I don't want to give too much away about what's in the book, but of course, right at the end of the book, you see some images which are absolutely irrefutable proof of major international crimes and his father's involvement. And even that, he tries to find a way to wiggle around.
Now, it is a weakness in me that I find it strange meeting grandchildren, children of Nazis, even ones who atone so deeply like Nicholas does. And, watching you with him in the movie is very moving. but I can't really even imagine myself spending time, you know, dealing with Horst, really. And his father was directly involved in your family's
Yes.
murders. And I think, is it the lawyer in you that is able to make this distinction? I mean, he is there defending his father. How are you able to take your personal feelings out of that?
He defends his father up to a point. I mean, he's not a Holocaust denier. That would be very, very difficult. Nor is he a Nazi. That would be very difficult. What his position is yes, my father was involved, as millions were involved. He would have rather things had gone in a different way, but what could he do? He was swept along. And that, of course, goes back to your previous question and raises a fundamental question, which I think all of us have to put our hands on our hearts and say, quite honestly, we don't know. Are there circumstances in which we too would be swept along in positions where we would do things with the benefit of hindsight? Wow, how could I possibly have done that? So the other thing, of course, that cuts in is my whole training as an academic and as a lawyer in court is not to show emotion, not to allow your own emotions to dominate. One of the golden rules in court is you don't reveal to the judges your own personal feelings about things. And I've integrated that into the writing, both of East West Street and of the Ratliner. So I'm professionally trained to take some distance, but more to the point, you know, I spent years in analysis. I know it's not fashionable for British people to say that. Americans can say that, but that's what I did. And so I've come to understand a lot of things. In the making of the film and of the podcast, I had the assistance of two wonderful psychoanalysts because we were concerned about aspects of the making of this. And so it was a question of digging very, very deep. Plus, I think the final thing I'd say is I'm very attracted to writers like Stefan Zweig, who strip the emotional. It's very personal, and he's a very passionate man and a passionate writer, but he doesn't wear that emotion on his sleeve, or at least on the pages of his texts. And I think that one of the challenges when writing about this is not to impose upon the reader your own personal views or conclusions. Readers are smart. They will draw out of the text their own conclusions as to what the facts say or what they want to think about it. And people will interpret it differently. It's very interesting. You must have had it with your book also. 10 people will read the same 4 pages and come to totally different views.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, one thing I've been struck with in the reviews of your book is there hasn't been much talk of Charlotte, actually. And so for those who haven't read the book yet, Charlotte was Horst's mother, Otto's wife, and she is a very important figure in the book. And without giving anything away, there's a moment when Horst hands over documents that were hers, and they are incredible. And it's one of the most exciting bits when we see you when we read about you going through those. And I wondered how that was for you, because, you know, at that point, we're suddenly seeing the story through Charlotte's eyes, through the woman's eyes, and you're getting the almost domestic experience.
No, I mean, it's really interesting. This is very important for me. Actually, a couple of the reviews have focused on Charlotte.
Oh, right. Sorry.
No, that's fine. And those have pleased me, not for what they've said about the book, but for me, Charlotte is actually the beating heart of this book. She is the reason that Horst does what he does for his father. As he says to me on numerous occasions, I didn't know my father. I didn't love my father. I loved my mother. My mother looked after me. She is both an awful human being and an extraordinary human being. She is an anti-Semite. She is a total Nazi sympathizer. She helps her husband at all times. She encourages him to climb up the greasy pole. And then when the situation collapses after the war, she is extraordinary. She's bringing up 6 children on her own, completely impecunious, and she's looking after a husband who is hiding not so far away for 3 years, saving his life. And however much I despise her views, there is something at the human level as a mother and as a spouse who has been much abused by her husband, who is a serial philanderer. And all of that is captured in the letters and the diaries. In fact, I've systematically asked, when being invited on these kinds of conversations, to do them with female interlocutors, because I think that women will read the book differently. You, Ali Granny Smith, Elif Shafik. I'm not going to say it's a woman's book. It's not a woman's book. It's a book for all human beings. But I think that a female eye, or many female eyes, will read this material in a very different way. So, for example, the kinds of anecdotes that I've put in. Charlotte arrives in Berlin in 1936. Her husband has had to flee Austria. He's killed the Austrian Chancellor, Dollfuss. This is a top-table criminal. And having been separated for 2 years, she discovers he's having an affair with a young German lady called Traute. A year later, she falls pregnant. They have a child. She has her first daughter. How does she get her back on her husband and probably on the child? She names the daughter Traute. And it's this complex relationship between two very headstrong individuals who are sitting at the top table that absolutely fascinates me. He needs her as much as she needs him. It's an extraordinary relationship.
And one of the big questions about her, of course, is how much she actually knew. And do you have a sense of that?
She knew everything. She knew absolutely everything. I mean, the materials that you refer to, the archive is extraordinary. It's 10,000 pages. It is her complete diaries, more or less, from 1929, from the moment she met him, until 1949, the moment he died in strange circumstances in a Roman hospital. It's her reminiscences, because she goes, at the end of her life, around looking for people who knew her husband and interviews them and records conversations with them to try to present the children with a composite picture of the greatness of the husband. And we have some of a lot of his letters and a lot of his diaries. So you can trace the entirety of a relationship. And I was helped by extraordinary people. I mean, the catalyst for this project was the wonderful Lisa Jardine, who was the one who said, "You've got extraordinary material here, you must write it." And her last PhD student, James Everest, and one of my students, Lea Mein-Klinkst, who are much more proficient in German than I am, which is almost not at all, helped me extraordinarily. It was a team effort, but the diaries and her material are absolutely remarkable.
Now, one of the parts of the book that I really enjoyed the most is the post-war bit. What happened to the Nazis after the war? Because, in books about Nazism or movies or whatever, we see the war. We don't see this kind of pathetic ending of what happened, this kind of, sort of dark, shady dealings of getting here, there, and everywhere. And it's fascinating me about, the Vatican's part in a lot of this. And I wondered, has the Vatican ever come to terms with its complicity? I didn't know much about this at all.
Well, this is a very big issue right now, because as you probably know, as many of the people who are watching here will know, Pope Francis, rightly but courageously, decided a year and a half ago to open up the entire archive of Pius XII, who was Pope from 1939 till the late 1950s, and into whose Roman Empire Otto arrived in the spring of 1949, to be looked after not by the Vatican as such, not by Pius XII, but by an Austrian bishop who helped various people like Barbie and Mengele and others to escape. So the first time that I met Horst, we talked about the war. I was interested in acts of killing, not acts of disappearance. And it was only when we got to Lviv in 2014, 2015, that I started getting interested. So what actually happened to your dad? I mean, I knew he died in 1949, and Horst would just say he died. That was all he'd say. And with the letters, we have the complete account, but in coded form. So it took years to unravel what had actually happened, because every time a character or an act was written about in a letter home or in a diary, it was encrypted. So someone was called the religious gentleman, or G, or HG1 or HG2. And we spent 4 years decoding the letters and diaries from 1945 to 1945, and from 45 to 49. And what we came across was stunning. I mean, I knew a little bit about it. We've all seen, The Boys from Brazil, Marathon Man. We've read bits and pieces. But what we have is the absolute story of an alliance between senior Vatican officials who were in the pay of the Americans, with Italian fascists, with Nazis, senior SS officers, united by what? United by the new enemy, the Soviets, the communists, the Bolsheviks. Now, I stumbled into this and I needed a lot of help because I'm not an expert on this. And I got help from extraordinary writers and scholars and spy novelists who were able to explain to me what happened. But that story is still not well told, and I think it's a deeply shocking story. I wonder if this is a moment to turn the tables, Hadley.
Okay, good. All right.
I don't know whether you have one last question or whether I should get cracking.
Well, I was going to just ask, I know you're working on something new now, but I didn't know what it was. So I wanted to hear about that.
Well, I mean, this will end up being a trilogy, and there is one character in the Rat Line. Otto Wächter arrives in Rome on the 29th of April, 1949. The religious gentleman parks him into a monastery, the Vigna Pia Monastery, the Pious Vine. He occupies a monk's cell which has been recently vacated. It is vacated by a man called Wachter, another SS officer, an old comrade who's made his way to Syria. He spends a year there. He then goes to Bolivia. He then goes to Argentina. In 1955, he ends up in Chile, becomes a businessman, and 18 years after that, he becomes an interrogator for the regime of Senator Pinochet.
Oh,
and
right.
remarkably, you could not invent this. He interrogates a Chilean writer who will later write an affidavit accusing Rauf of torture, which makes its way into the hands of the Spanish prosecutor in Spain, who brings the proceedings against Pinochet in 1998, which you will remember.
Of course.
In which case I was involved,
right.
so that the work of Wachter lands on my desk in London in November 1998. It's absolutely seamless. And it happens the day of the stone setting of my grandfather, which is, of course, how this whole story began in 1904 with the birth of my grandfather in Lviv. So it is completely seamless.
Wow.
And that will take another 5 years to write. So there's a bit of time, but it's that's the next phase of it.
Oh, incredible. I can't wait to read it. Amazing, Philippe. What a trilogy you've done. That's extraordinary.
Well, let's wait and see. Let's talk about the glasses.
Okay.
Where to begin on the glasses? What made you, Hadley, renowned journalist? We
Sure.
read you regularly in The Guardian and in other places. Of course, it was very familiar to me, your wonderful book, which I had the privilege of reviewing in The Guardian, because I'd trodden a similar path. Why did you tread that path?
Why did I?
What happened?
I know, I keep thinking, why didn't I just write that funny comic novel about a young woman living in a big city? Why did I spend 20 years in Polish and French archives? All I can say, it's a compulsion, like wanting to have children. Like, you cannot explain it. It's illogical. It's just something you have to do. And what started it for me was just knowing how unhappy my grandmother had been. And I grew up in New York, and the story all Jewish American kids are told is that coming to America was the happy ending for Jewish immigrants. They were so happy to be here, away from dark, scary Europe, that land of death. And I knew that wasn't the case with my grandmother. And so it started there. And then I found this shoebox in her closet after kind of starting to hunt around a little and having known nothing about my grandmother. It was full of letters between her and her brothers from the 1930s to the 1980s, photographs of them from the 1920s and earlier in Poland, drawing by Picasso, photos from concentration camps. And at that point, that was it. I'm afraid I was hooked for the next 15 years of research.
What happens to us, do you think? Because the paths we followed is a similar path. You reach a certain age.
Yes.
You've done what you do in your life. Children, you settle down with a partner. And then what is it? You start asking yourself questions, because in the review that I wrote of your book, I dealt with it in part that you were not only exploring who these people were, but really who you were. It was about your own identity. Perhaps I was superimposing my own sense of why I wanted to know about my grandfather. Was that a fair sentiment?
I think it must be. Anybody who writes about their family is trying to find out who they are. I think a large part of it for me, by the time I spent so long researching, it was 2000 to 2008, 17, I think I started writing. Would that be right? 2018. By the time I started writing, I had 2 children. And a large part of it was I wanted them to know who they were. That was a real big spur for me. I wanted them to know their Jewish European heritage, because we are so secular. You know, I wanted them to know where they'd come from. And there was always a part of me that felt very much closer in my mind to my father's family than I showed in reality. I was not close to them in reality. I found my grandmother difficult. And yet in my head, she's always there. And I needed to find out that story. I needed to get it out, really. And yes, of course, we're all trying to find out who we are. And I think all Jews, well, I should rephrase that. So many Jews are obsessed with the Holocaust and what happened, what our ancestors went through to ensure that we survived. And we need to deal with that in some way.
There's a point in your book, I didn't address this in the review, where you talk about the sense of assimilation. And you actually expressed a view that I wasn't sure that I shared that view, about that sense of being part of the new community into which you have snuck. You've experienced that both in the US and in the UK. And you describe your grandmother and your great uncles, is what I think they are.
Yeah.
Some have assimilated or did assimilate differently or better, or can you say a little bit about your views on assimilation then and assimilation today? And is it as easy as perhaps a point, if I understood you correctly, you thought it could be for us and for our generation?
Well, it's hard. I mean, I feel, for me, I mean, I'm sure there are American, if there are any Americans out there, they will think I've totally assimilated. I moved to Britain when I was 11. I've moved back and forth all my life. But any American listening to me will think I sound English. But any English person listening to me thinks I sound American. I think I haven't really assimilated, to be honest, in this country. My parents are very unassimilated. They're extremely American. And that affects how I haven't assimilated. Whereas my sister made a very conscious effort to be assimilated. And as soon as the plane landed on Heathrow in 1990, she was talking with an English accent. So I think there's an element of it having to be almost a conscious effort, at least at first. It's really a lot harder to lose your origins than I think people think. I think people look at Madonna when she moved here and married Guy Ritchie and suddenly she was talking like Lady Dowager. I think that's how it happens. That's not how it happens. You have to really make the effort. But at the same time, of course, there are elements that assimilation happens naturally. And it's also a conscious effort to fight against that. My great uncle Alex made a conscious effort all his life not to assimilate. He was going to have his Yiddish accent. He was going to talk in his sort of very Polish working class way, while at the same time mixing very much with the Parisian bourgeoisie. My grandmother similarly made a real effort not to lose her French accent, which itself was assimilated, and was kind of imposed. She imposed on herself. When she moved to America, she lived in America 50 years or 60 years. She never lost that French accent. So both those things go both ways.
And what about the assimilation of being Jewish in a new community? I mean, the four Glasses who arrive in Paris from another place, as my grandfather did. In fact, one of them, they were in the same French military institution in Barcarès, actually the same regiment, although not at the same time.
Right, oh wow.
That question of assimilation as Jews in France in the 1930s,
yeah,
and in Britain in the 20s. Parallels or not?
That's interesting. God, well, obvious. I don't want to be. I would have thought 5 years ago, 6 years ago, that it's very easy in this country to assimilate as Jews, and for me, I have found what's happened in the past 4 years in the Labour Party. What that brought out in me, I realized my identity was so primarily Jewish. And I suddenly felt very unassimilated in some ways. And especially seeing the reactions of a lot of people I call friends, colleagues in newspapers, whatever, defending some elements of the Labour Party, dismissing the claims of anti-Semitism within the left. I suddenly felt to find by them as Jewish, that I was being difficult, that I was being this kind of difficult Jew raising these issues. That was a real shock to me. And I'm sure that whole experience also helped motivate me to write the book. Certainly for my family, when they arrived in Paris in 1920 to 1924, they found that it was a lot harder to assimilate as foreign Jews than perhaps they'd expected. So yeah, there are perhaps parallels. I don't. Is that how you feel as well?
Yeah. Curiously, I feel more Jewish today than I would have 10 years ago. I
Yes,
don't know
I'm
whether
sure.
that is a consequence of having done this research,
yes,
or
yes.
what is happening in the world and in Britain and in Europe today. But I generally do share that feeling. Now, does that feeling, having immersed yourself in your family history and knowing now, it's one thing to know in general what happened to your family members.
Oh, yeah.
It's quite another when you have names and places and you've made the same journeys that I have to particular spots where terrible things happen. It's transformative. Does that make you feel more vulnerable and connected and understanding, or does that have some other consequence?
It made me angrier, actually. And when I came across the denunciation letter, there was a letter that my grandmother had kept. There was a denunciation letter of her oldest brother Henri and his wife Sonia that their neighbors had put on their door, saying this family is Jewish, they are hiding at this address. And seeing it in that French handwriting that we all know, the looped cursive handwriting, that felt incredibly painful. And in a horrible way, it did make me look around at some people in the public eye, or even in conversations that I would have, who would be excusing very, to me, obvious examples of anti-Semitism in Britain, particularly on the left. It made me look at them differently. It made me see how easily people cannot see things. And I would say I wrote a lot of this book with a lot of anger. And when I wrote it the first time, I put in a lot of contemporary references. I put in a lot of stuff about Ken Livingstone, Jeremy Corbyn, et cetera, et cetera. And then I finished it and I thought, I do not want this book to be a newspaper column. This book will come out, those people will be gone. And I just stuck 2 references to Corbyn in the footnotes at the back, which nobody will ever look at. I'd say a lot of it was written with anger, and I wasn't writing about this so much in the paper, about the whole anti-Semitism and labor thing. I know Guardian readers think I write about it all the time. I think I wrote about it once or twice. Instead, I channeled those feelings into the book. So it's made me, probably, and I think probably writing the book, because this was going on as I was writing it, it made me angrier about the labor situation. And I should also say, obviously, about Trump in America, and when he was describing anti-Semitic protesters as very fine people. That made me much angrier than perhaps it would have been otherwise. And researching America's history with fascism in the chapter on my grandfather, who was born in New York and grew up there in 1900 to 1930, and talking to my dad as well about growing up in America after the war, and how he was one of the very few number of Jews allowed into his college, Lehigh. I think only 10% of a class was allowed to be Jewish, and that was in 1957. That I hadn't thought about. And then my father said to me, he reminded me, honey, when we lived in New York, we had a house upstate. There was a country club near us. They weren't allowing Jews in. And that, my childhood.
We've both had to confront personal stories that are complex. As you will know from East-West Street, there was a moment where I had to confront the possibility that the man I loved as my grandfather may not be my biological grandfather.
Right.
And this imposed all sorts of moral dilemmas. What right did I have as a grandson to impose on my mother possible information that may be very distressing? Perhaps what I could live with was one thing, but what rights did I have? With one of your great uncles, Alex, who for me is the most fascinating of characters, desperate to get to know Picasso, desperate to make his way up the greasy pole in an endearing way. You describe him in your childhood. And I really admired the way you confronted questions that you plainly had in relation to what exactly had he done during the war. And of course, one of the things that we know is we don't judge morally, because who knows what we would have done.
I know, that's right.
And so you step back, but you opened that door, causing me actually to go off and reading your book to do research of my own about some of the characters that he had met, because I became so fascinated. The guy who, the ballet russe in Paris.
Serge Liefers.
Serge Liefers. Tell me the thinking you went through as you confronted opening the door to material that might be hurtful, not for you, but for others who could still be alive today.
It was hard, and I was very conscious of my father's feelings. I didn't need to worry so much about Alex's descendants, but my father loved Alex. He worked for Alex in Paris for many years, and my father was fearful of what I was going to discover too, while at the same time being incredibly supportive. And there was that moment, I think I was in the archive in Nice with my friend, who I met through doing the research, the wonderful Daniel Lee, who I'm sure is out there watching, who's a very brilliant historian. And we came across this letter from Xavier Vallat, who was basically in charge of all the anti-Semitic activity in France and taking away businesses from Jews, saying that Alex should be allowed to run his business in the south of France. And at that point, I really did think, that's it, he was in the pay. And it was, thankfully, Daniel was on hand to explain to me what this meant. This was actually just a sign that Xavier Vallat admired Alex's war record and this whole weird, complicated sort of political attitudes in Vichy versus the Nazis. But I was also, I was worried about finding it. I knew Alex. I was 21 when Alex died, so I had a lot of fondness for Alex, but the journalist hard heart in me was also thinking, be an interesting story. So I just wanted to know the truth, really. And the truth was that Alex always told the truth. It's the weird truth.
And a question that I asked myself a lot, if one comes across something with one's own family that is deeply negative, what is to be done? What do we do? You, it seems, did not in the end have to confront that reality. There's ambiguity, but it doesn't really go higher than that.
Yeah.
How does one approach that question morally? We're talking about family secrets.
Yeah.
Every family has secrets. Everyone has their secret history. What is our responsibility as the third generation on, so to speak, in relation to such material? Who do we owe a duty to?
Well, I felt when I went into this that my duty was to honor these people. I didn't want them to be forgotten. I thought they had incredible stories. I wanted their names to be known. But then as I went on, I thought, if I do find out something about Alex, like what if I found out that he shopped his brother, for example, in exchange for him being able to escape? I really had no idea. Why was Jacques arrested so early, which was another brother, and Alex escapes? That didn't make any sense. And the fact that Alex thrived during the war. There was a part of me that thought at one point maybe he did this. I have no idea. It seemed unlikely, but it was possible. If I'd found that, what I'd have done, and it sounds terrible saying it, is I'd have waited 20 years for my parents to no longer be here, for the second generation to no longer be here. And then I'd write it, because I would never do anything while they were alive that would hurt them. But I feel that these human stories should be known. These are ordinary people, your grandfather, my grandmother, their great uncles. I want these stories to be known. I feel like this is a way that people really relate to the past then, is when they hear stories like yours and mine.
So this is for me fascinating, because this brings us full square back to where you began with your question to me about Horst. What's the difference then between what you've been doing and what Horst has been doing? Because Horst accepts that his father did terrible things, but is not a criminal, but wants to find the things that he did were good things, so that a balance is created. Is that a reasonable thing to do? As you read about Horst, was there a part of you that felt an empathy, or did you think, yuck, no, this is not for me?
I don't know. I am a journalist, a writer. I wasn't here trying to do propaganda for my family. But I think for a personal research, if, who knows the trauma someone goes through if you grew up knowing your father was a member of the Nazi Party, not just a member, a very high official. I can understand from his perspective I completely understood what he was doing. I wasn't looking at him thinking this is some crazy psychopath. His actions make no sense. His actions make total sense. I don't really want to have dinner with him, hearing him tell me how wonderful his father was. But for him personally, of course, I don't think anyone would buy his book on his father, particularly, especially, but they will definitely buy your book on his father. I mean, he himself is a fascinating character study, as you spotted right from the start. But what would you have done if you'd found something terrible about your grandfather?
I mean, the question about my grandfather was during the Paris years when he worked for l'UGIF, which some saw not as sort of collaborationist, but as providing assistance. As you know, what happened when communities were overrun, occupied by the Nazis, they would create Jewish organizations, and those Jewish organizations were then used, if you like, in providing names and identities and addresses, which of course was then used to round people up. And I mean, I confronted that. I didn't find anything that tied my grandfather directly to anything. I found some resistance activity that he had been involved in, but I think I was listening to your answer. I mean, there was the one moment that I confronted where I tracked down the granddaughter of the person I believed to be my grandmother's lover in Vienna, the reason that she had stayed behind in Vienna. And she asked me to do a DNA test with her. And eventually I agreed. It took a few months. And when the pack arrived to do the DNA swab, a bit like coronavirus, you swab and you send it off somewhere. She emailed me to say she'd done hers in 2 seconds. I sat on mine for 6 months because of the question that you asked.
Yeah.
And in the end, I sent it off. And the answer came back. I don't want to give everything away for those who've not read East-West Street, but the answer came back as it did. And I had decided by the time I sent it off, I would write about it, whatever it said, because that was my responsibility.
Right.
But if it had come back in a particular way, would I have done that? I don't know. And these are, I mean, our relations with our family are absolutely precious and crucial. And what would we do? These are really big questions. I wonder if this is a moment that we've now got to go over
to go to the audience. Yeah. We have many questions for you here, Philippe. Let's start with the first one. Are you still friends with Horst, is the first question.
Well, we're in touch. I exchanged emails with him a couple of weeks ago. The book came out a week ago. I sent him the first copy, and inscribed it very warmly. It's reached other members of his family. There was a big double spread in an Austrian newspaper, and it's silent. So I'm waiting for the reaction. I feel protective towards him. You touched on why, when there was a moment where he described to me his 6th birthday party in 1945, April, the war's coming to an end, his entire family situation is collapsing, and his world has collapsed. And I've realized in that moment of conversation with him, his entire life is about recreating the world of childhood, that comfort, that security. And that's not a bad thing to do, except that, as you know well, his father was a mass murderer. So no, we are in touch. I'm sure we will see each other again. I was due to be in Vienna this week. He was going to come to the Vienna launch. It's now been pushed back to December. He will come. We'll go out for dinner. We'll chat. We'll disagree. But life will go on.
And this is another good one. So Anastasia O'Brien says, I was surprised to learn from your book, Philippe, how many of the Nazi executioners were Austrian, including, of course, Otto von Wächter. To what extent is the rat line a story about Austria's engagement with its troubling past?
That's an excellent question. Nicholas Frank, of course, is German. Horst Wächter is Austrian. In 1955, Austria signed a treaty for its independence, basically. And Article 1 of that treaty declared that Austrians were the first victims of Nazism. And that became the narrative for the next 30 years. That is a narrative that I think has explained why Austria's engagement, which is now taking place, undoubtedly, has been slower than Germany's engagement. But it's downplayed. So, for example, one of the big characters in the rat line is Otto's best friend and mentor and Horst's godfather. Horst sleeps with a photograph of his godfather near his bed, Arthur Seyss-Inquart. For the Dutch in the audience, Seyss-Inquart was the governor of Nazi-occupied Holland, who wreaked misery on tens, if not hundreds of thousands of human beings, Jews and Dutch and others. And Seyss-Inquart was on trial in the first famous Nuremberg trial, and he was hanged, as Otto would have been hanged if he had been caught. So the Austrians were absolutely on the front line, disproportionately active, I would say, in the top echelons, and that story has not been fully told, and it's down. It tends to be downplayed. On the other hand, I think there's a new generation of Austrians. I'm thinking of the Austrian ambassador in London. I'm thinking of many of my friends in Austria who absolutely are seeking now to engage with the past in a way that is more consonant with the way in which Germany engages with these issues. But I think one cannot escape the reality that how Germany has dealt with it and how Austria has dealt with it are different. And that explains the differences between Nicholas and Horst.
Here's a question for both of us. That is something that I was thinking about was, at what point did you tell your living families that you were writing a book about their ancestors? And were you ever tempted to fictionalize their stories instead to protect them? That is actually something my father asked me a lot over my 20 years of dragging my feet. Why don't you just write a novel about grandma? And I feel about that question the way friends say they feel when people say to them, oh, if you're having trouble having children, why don't you just adopt? As though that's the easy option. I mean, to me, writing a novel does not seem very easy. To me, sticking with the facts seems easier. So I never wanted to write a novel about it. And I also just knew it was true. So to say it's not true seemed absurd. I just needed to find the right documents in the right French archive. Did you ever think about doing it as fiction, Philippe?
No, no. I mean, I have thought of writing. I have actually once written a novel, which is so bad that it remains behind me, tucked away in a drawer over there. I think my skills are in non-fiction. If I have any skills, if I have any abilities, it's in non-fiction. There was one thing to do with fiction that did come up on East-West Street. My two protagonists in that book, Hirsch Lauterpacht, inventor of crimes against humanity, Raphael Lemkin, inventor of crime of genocide, Polish Jews who studied at the same law school in the University of Lemberg, never actually met. And I wrote a scene imagining that they had met. And my editor in New York, at Alfred Knopf, she's fearless and terrifying and incandescent with fury. And she said, the moment anyone reads this book and suspects any part of it is not true, you've lost the reader. So I ran away very fast.
It's from Michael Stavy here for Philippe. As a practicing lawyer, could you accept the defense of Otto if he was captured and tried in the Nuremberg trial, or does it depend on the legal code that the trial was held under?
There's so many ways of answering that excellent question. I mean, the first question, what I thought you were going to ask was, if Otto had been caught, would I defend him? As you know,
that's a question. I'd ask that.
That's a question. The English bar has something called the cab rank principle. We are like taxi drivers. We don't pick and choose. I've acted for some pretty bad people who have done some pretty bad things, including international crimes, including crimes against humanity, including genocide. I think you are allowed out if there's a personal difficulty. And I think, of course, one of the staggering things about East-West Street was the discovery that Lauterpacht and Lemkin were prosecuting the man, Hans Frank, who had killed their own family. You can't do that in modern legal systems. Right. You can't prosecute someone where there's a personal connection, and you can't defend someone where there's a personal connection. I absolutely believe he is entitled to a defense. Shockingly, the English bar, it is the only time it's ever happened in the history of the English bar, adopted a rule saying that no English barrister could act for the defense in the Nuremberg trials, which meant that all the defendants, German and Austrian, 22 of them, had to use German lawyers who had never engaged in cross-examination. And they were confronted with a trial style that was completely alien to them, which I have to say, if I feel a tad of sympathy about anything, it would be about that. But I have said to Horst, I have no doubt whatsoever that if he had been caught, I mean, you just need to read the material in the book. I think it speaks for itself. If he'd been caught, he would, like everyone else of his rank who had been caught, he would have been convicted of crimes against humanity and genocide, and he would have been hanged. No question.
Does Horst accept that?
No.
At all?
Doesn't.
He doesn't.
There was a fantastic moment when we were in Lviv with a film crew from the BBC, my dear friend David Evans, and Nicholas Frank. And Nicholas had left the room. We found ourselves in some obscure castle near Brody, where the great writer Joseph Roth used to live. And Nicholas left the room to go and have a pee or something. And the cameras were turned off, at which point Horst stands up and he bangs on a glass and he says, right, I'm going to say this once and once only. In my presence, no one is to describe my father as a war criminal. And he's absolutely wedded to that view. I mean, I call him a war criminal, or criminal, because he would have been. But someone said to me, you've caused him to adopt this position, Philippe.
That's an interesting idea.
Actually, again, as you know from the book, he had expressed, I'm being careful, I don't want to give away too much because there's so many.
But he has dug his heels in over the years more. Is that fair to say?
He has dug his heels in more over the years. But there are surprises, as you know, of who emerges from the woodwork and what has happened subsequently. So I fear that I have caused him to dig his heels in more, actually, which does bother me a little bit.
Why do you, someone asked this here, let me see if I can find the question. Here it is, from Richard Ryman. I mean, that brings to this question, which is, why do you think Hans Frank's son and Otto's son react so differently to their fathers? Are they equally anti-Nazi in truth?
Again, I mean, that's a huge question. We did an event together, Nicholas and Horst and I, at the Purcell Room, which was filmed. You can see bits of it in My Nazi Legacy, what our fathers did or did not do, as Horst would like to put it. 500 seats sold out in about 3.5 minutes, hearing two guys talk about the wonders or horrors of their father. And what emerged in that conversation, Nicholas turned to Horst at one point and he said, the real difference between us is that my father was a bad father, yours was a good father. And that explains the difference. Now, I'm seeing the wonders of technology. I'm seeing the immediate skepticism on your face.
I mean, Otto wasn't around. Like, I don't see how we can say that.
I think it is to do with the relationship with the mothers.
Yes, clearly.
I mean, Horst loves his father through his mother. His mother idolizes the husband, and Horst, to show his love for his mother, I think, has put his father on a sort of mini pedestal. But there is also the other point that you raised, the German-Austrian thing. And then there's just the possibility that human beings are just different and people react differently to different things. We've read the book by Lionel Shriver, We Must Talk About Kevin. And how would you and I react if one of our children became a mass murderer? I mean, I put my hand on my heart. What would I do? What would I hope that doesn't happen? I don't think it'll happen. But what if it does happen? What if your father is a mass murderer? Do you stop loving your father? How is it to go through life knowing that your father is involved in the killing of 1 million people in the case of Wächter, or 4 million people in the case of Frank? It is an overwhelming burden. You alluded to it later. I think the psychology of the human being is so complex, we can't possibly answer that question, but we can speculate, and speculation is interesting.
Well, it's a burden. I mean, it's an unimaginable burden to find out that your parent did something like that. I mean, it must be different if you find out your child has done something, because there's, to a certain extent, a parent feels responsible for their child's behavior. A child cannot feel responsible for its parent's behavior, especially in the case of Horst, who didn't know his father. His father wasn't around. So it's clearly, I mean, I don't want to psychoanalyze a man I've never met, but like you say, and you make clear in the book, this is a show of respect for his mother. Like, he is keeping alive his mother's work in terms of personalizing his father, in a sense.
But as your book shows, one of the beauties of life is that things get passed on through the generations.
Yes, absolutely.
And it doesn't stop with Horst's generation. Horst and Nicholas both have a child.
Yeah.
They each have a daughter. Those daughters come to play a role in these stories. And those daughters have themselves had children. And those children, who are now in their teenage years, are starting to ask questions of their grandparents. And what happens when the grandchild gets a different answer from the grandfather than from the mother about what great-grandfather Otto did or did not get up to during the war? I mean, the complexities of family life. I grew up in a household where I saw things from one side of the story. We were on the same side, if you like, you and I, on the receiving end. And so we grew up with silences. We grew up, so much in your book, I recognized those conversations when you'd be at family gatherings and there would be whisperings and someone looked like someone, or, it was completely familiar to me. But I'd never thought about it from the other side. And it comes back to a question that you asked at the outset, why I did it. Is it, obsession? What is it? All of a sudden, I realized there are millions of people out there living on the other side of the story. And I had the privilege of meeting two of these people and their children and their children's children. And I'm fascinated by that, because also it's what I deal with in my day job. I mean, in December, I'm sitting in the International Court of Justice 3 feet from Aung San Suu Kyi, as I wrote about in The Guardian this weekend.
That's right.
Wondering, how can she stand up and defend what her military is doing to the Rohingya community? And I'm looking at her and I'm thinking, I think it's got to do with your relationship with your father, Aung San Suu Kyi.
So
a lot of people have said that. Things get passed on through the generations. And again, it comes back to tone. I think we have a responsibility as writers, as journalists, as a lawyer, as a writer, to step back, try, if we can, to strip the emotion and the passion out of it, and try to understand what really is going on here, and to do it honestly and with respect, even if we don't like what the people we're talking to are saying, to try to understand their perspective. It's not easy sometimes.
Sadly, I think that is all we have time for here. And I'm sorry for everyone whose questions I didn't get to, including a friend of yours, Philippe, I'm afraid, Andrew Evans, who has sent in a question. I'm very sorry. I see we're running out of time, but thank you so much to everyone who's joined. And thank you, obviously, to Philippe. And absolutely, please buy his wonderful book, and East West Street, if you haven't read it.
And Hadley's wonderful book.
The Mutual Appreciation Society.
2 wonderful books. Yes, it is indeed. Hadley, thank you so much.
Thank you, Philippe. And thank you, everyone out there.